In June 1942, 8 German saboteurs climbed out of 2 U-boats, 4 on a beach in Long Island, New York, and 4 on a beach near Jacksonville, Florida. They carried explosives, timers, and American currency. They wore civilian clothes, they spoke fluent English, and they had specific orders from the Abwehr, German military intelligence, about what to destroy first. Not shipyards, not munitions factories, not bridges or railroads. Aluminum smelters. Their target list included Alcoa plants in Tennessee, New York, and Illinois. The German High Command understood something that most Americans did not. The entire American air war, every B-17, every P-51, every B-29, every one of the 300,000 aircraft that the United States would eventually produce depended on a single metal made in a handful of factories powered by an enormous amount of electricity. Destroy the smelters and you cripple the American aircraft industry. Destroy the smelters and every bomber assembly line in the country grinds to a halt within weeks. The saboteurs were captured almost immediately. One of them, George Dash, lost his nerve and turned himself in to the FBI within days of landing. All 8 were convicted by military tribunal. 6 were executed by electric chair. The aluminum plants were never touched. But the Germans were right about the target. If there was a single industrial choke point in the American war machine, a single material without which the arsenal of democracy could not function, it was aluminum. And in 1941, the United States did not have nearly enough of it. This is the story of how America went from producing 164,000 tons of aluminum per year, less than Germany, to producing 1.25 million tons, more than all the Axis powers combined. It is a story about electricity, about geology, about monopoly, and about the staggering industrial expansion that turned the Pacific Northwest from a land of forests and rivers into the powerhouse that built 1/3 of every Allied aircraft in the war. Aluminum is the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust. It is everywhere, in clay, in soil, in virtually every rock formation on the planet. And for most of human history, it was completely inaccessible. The problem is chemistry. Aluminum bonds to oxygen with ferocious strength. Unlike iron, which can be smelted from its ore by heating it with charcoal in a furnace, aluminum oxide cannot be reduced by any chemical reducing agent at any practical temperature. The bond between aluminum and oxygen is simply too strong. For thousands of years, the most abundant metal on Earth was also the most expensive, rarer than gold in its pure form, used only for jewelry and scientific curiosities. This changed in 1886 when 2 young men, Charles Martin Hall in Oberlin, Ohio, and Paul Héroult in Paris, France, independently discovered the same process within months of each other. Both found that if you dissolve aluminum oxide in molten cryolite, a mineral composed of sodium, aluminum, and fluorine, and pass a powerful electric current through the solution, pure aluminum metal collects at the bottom of the vessel. The process is called the Hall-Heroult process, and it remains the only commercial method for producing aluminum to this day. The critical requirement is electricity. Enormous amounts of electricity. Producing 1 ton of aluminum requires approximately 15,000 kilowatt-hours of electrical energy, enough to power an American home for a year and a half. An aluminum smelter consumes more electricity than a small city. This is why aluminum production has always been located near cheap hydroelectric power, at Niagara Falls, along the Tennessee Valley, and crucially, along the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest. Charles Hall founded the Pittsburgh Reduction Company in 1888, which was renamed the Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa, in 1907. By 1940, Alcoa was the sole producer of primary aluminum in the United States. It owned the bauxite mines, the alumina refineries, the smelters, and much of the fabrication capacity. It was a monopoly in the most literal sense of the word. And in 1939, when the world went to war, that monopoly controlled a total production capacity of 164,000 tons per year, a fraction of what would be needed. An airplane is made of aluminum. This is a simplification, but not much of one. A B-17 Flying Fortress contained approximately 10,000 pounds of aluminum alloys. A B-29 Super Fortress contained even more. The skin, the ribs, the spars, the bulkheads, the control surfaces, the engine cowlings, the fuel tanks, the instrument panels, aluminum throughout. The structural alloy was 2024-3, an aluminum copper magnesium alloy, heat-treated to a tensile strength of 64,000 pounds per square inch, while weighing only 1/3 as much as steel. The T3 designation indicated that the alloy had been solution heat-treated and then cold-worked, a process that rearranged the internal crystal structure to maximize strength. Other alloys were used for different applications. 7075-T6, an aluminum zinc magnesium copper alloy, was even stronger and was used in structural members where maximum strength-to-weight ratio was critical. Alclad sheet, a sandwich of high-strength alloy clad with a thin layer of pure aluminum for corrosion resistance, was used for aircraft skins that had to survive years of exposure to weather and salt spray. These alloys were not simple metals. They were engineered materials, developed by Alcoa's metallurgists over decades of research, and their precise compositions and heat treatments were closely guarded industrial secrets. The ability to produce them consistently, in sheet and extrusion form, at the tonnages required by wartime aircraft production was an industrial capability that no other nation matched. No other metal could do this. Steel was too heavy. A steel airplane would barely get off the ground. Magnesium was lighter, but burned with terrifying intensity when hit by incendiary ammunition. Wood was used in some British aircraft. The de Havilland Mosquito was built almost entirely of plywood, but wood could not be manufactured to the precision tolerances required for high-performance fighters or pressurized bombers. Aluminum was the only material that combined lightweight, structural strength, corrosion resistance, and manufacturability in the quantities required to build an air force. In 1939, President Roosevelt asked Congress for $300 million to build aircraft for the Army Air Corps, which at the time possessed only 1,700 planes. Congress authorized 3,251 aircraft. This was considered ambitious. By the end of the war, the United States would produce nearly 300,000 military aircraft. Aircraft manufacturing would go from 41st place among American industries to first place. And every one of those aircraft would require aluminum. 300,000 aircraft, approximately 3 billion pounds of aluminum, more aluminum than the United States had produced in its entire history prior to the war. The math was terrifying, and in February 1941, the federal government finally admitted what engineers and military planners had known for months. The United States faced a catastrophic aluminum shortage. The shortage was not merely a failure of planning, it was a failure of industrial structure. Alcoa was the only primary aluminum producer in the United States. Reynolds Metals, founded by Richard S. Reynolds Sr., had entered the aluminum business in the late 1930s by building a refinery and smelter at Lister Hill, Alabama, and a smelter at Longview, Washington. But Reynolds was tiny compared to Alcoa. Henry Kaiser, the construction magnate who would later build Liberty ships, was interested in aluminum but had not yet entered the business. Alcoa was reluctant to expand. The company had invested heavily in production capacity during the First World War, only to see demand collapse after the armistice. The memory of that bust and the unsold inventory that followed made Alcoa's management cautious. They were willing to increase production gradually, but they were not willing to risk the massive capital investment required for the kind of expansion the government was demanding. What if the war ended quickly? What if the government canceled its contracts? Alcoa had been burned before. The government had its own reasons for frustration. An antitrust lawsuit filed against Alcoa in 1937 was working its way through the courts. Secretary of the Interior Harold Ikes was openly hostile to Alcoa's monopoly and objected to granting the company additional access to hydroelectric power from the Bonneville Power Administration. The political dynamics were toxic. The government needed Alcoa's expertise but resented its market power, while Alcoa needed government contracts but feared government interference. The solution was an uncomfortable partnership. Alcoa invested $300 million of its own money in expanding its production facilities. The company built new smelters at Lister Hill, Alabama, and expanded existing operations across Tennessee, North Carolina, and New York. The government, through the Defense Plant Corporation, financed an additional $450 million in new aluminum plants, a staggering investment that reflected the scale of the emergency. Alcoa managed 22 government-owned plants during the war, 8 smelters, 10 fabricating plants, 2 alumina refineries, and 2 processing plants for low-grade bauxite. The expansion unfolded in 3 phases. The first phase, beginning in October 1941, expanded existing Alcoa facilities and brought new privately funded capacity online. The second phase, beginning in February 1942, used Defense Plant Corporation financing to construct new smelters in locations near inexpensive hydroelectric power, primarily the Pacific Northwest, so the plants could be converted to commercial use after the war. The third phase was an emergency program that built smelters near large industrial areas using power from existing grids, with the understanding that these plants would be uneconomical in peacetime and would be shut down when the war ended. The speed of construction was extraordinary. A peacetime aluminum smelter might take 2 to 3 years to design, permit, and build. Wartime smelters were completed in months. The government cut through every bureaucratic obstacle, environmental review, labor negotiations, material allocation, with the blunt authority of wartime emergency powers. Workers labored in shifts around the clock, pouring concrete foundations in the rain, erecting steel frameworks, installing the massive electrical bus bars that would carry hundreds of thousands of amperes to the electrolytic pots. But the government also deliberately encouraged competitors. Reynolds received government financing to build additional smelters. Kaiser entered the aluminum business with government-backed plants. The deliberate policy of creating competition, using wartime emergency powers to break a peacetime monopoly, would transform the American aluminum industry permanently. By 1956, Alcoa's share of North American aluminum capacity had dropped from 100% to 33%. Reynolds and Kaiser held the rest, built entirely with wartime government-financed plants that were sold to them after the war at favorable prices. The monopoly was broken, but first it had to win the war. The key to the aluminum expansion was not technology. It was not bauxite. It was not even money. It was electricity. Aluminum smelting devours electricity. A single smelter can consume 300 to 500 megawatts, the output of a medium-sized power plant, around the clock every day without interruption. The Hall-Heroult process runs continuously. The electrolytic cells, called pots, operate at roughly 960 degrees Celsius, and if the current is interrupted even briefly, the molten cryolite solidifies and the pots must be rebuilt at enormous expense. An aluminum smelter does not shut down for weekends, holidays, or maintenance. It runs until the war ends or the power fails. Where do you find that much electricity? The answer in 1941 was the Columbia River. The New Deal had built 2 massive hydroelectric dams on the Columbia, Bonneville Dam, completed in 1938, and Grand Coulee Dam, completed in 1941. Grand Coulee, with an initial generating capacity of 1,974 megawatts, was the largest hydroelectric power plant in the world. These dams had been built to provide cheap electricity to the Pacific Northwest, to irrigate farmland, and to create jobs during the Depression. Their wartime significance was an unintended consequence, but a decisive one. The U.S. government appropriated $2 billion to increase the generating capacity of the Columbia River system by 6-fold. New generators were installed at Bonneville and Grand Coulee. Additional dams were planned or accelerated. The electricity flowed to aluminum smelters that were built with astonishing speed along the Columbia and its tributaries at Vancouver, Washington, Longview, Washington, Troutdale, Oregon, and elsewhere. It has been estimated that electricity from Grand Coulee Dam alone provided the power to produce the aluminum in approximately 1/3 of all the aircraft built during the Second World War. One dam, one river, 1/3 of every Allied airplane. The Axis powers understood the importance of hydroelectric power to aluminum production, but they could not match what the Columbia River provided. Germany had access to Norwegian hydropower after its 1940 invasion, but a combination of sabotage, resistance, and inadequate infrastructure prevented Norway from becoming the aluminum powerhouse that German planners had hoped for. German aluminum production peaked at approximately 282,000 tons in 1943, less than 1/4 of American output. Japan, similarly constrained by limited hydroelectric capacity, peaked at 151,000 tons in 1944. Combined Axis aluminum production never approached the American total. The river, the Columbia River, with its New Deal dams and its wartime generators, was as much a weapon as any bomber it helped build. The production chain that turned a tropical clay into a fighter plane was one of the most energy-intensive and geographically dispersed industrial processes in existence. It began with bauxite, the raw ore, a reddish-brown clay found in tropical and subtropical regions where millions of years of heavy rainfall had leached away the more soluble minerals, leaving behind a concentration of aluminum oxides. In 1941, American bauxite came primarily from Arkansas, which had significant deposits, and from the Caribbean, British Guyana, now Guyana, and Dutch Guyana, now Suriname. The Caribbean bauxite was higher grade and cheaper to mine, but it had to be shipped across the ocean. 12 days before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, American troops arrived in Dutch Guyana to protect its bauxite mines, in cooperation with the exiled government of the Netherlands in London. The government understood that the loss of Caribbean bauxite would cripple aluminum production as surely as the destruction of a smelter. This was not an exaggeration. Dutch Guyana, modern Suriname, was one of the world's leading bauxite producers. The Surinamish Bauxite Maatschappij, a subsidiary of Alcoa, had been operating the Moingo bauxite deposits since 1916. By 1941, these mines were producing hundreds of thousands of tons of high-grade bauxite per year, shipped directly to alumina refineries on the American Gulf Coast. British Guyana, next door, provided additional tonnage through Alcan's operations at Mackenzie on the Demerara River. The Caribbean bauxite supply route was vulnerable. German U-boats patrolled the waters between South America and the Gulf of Mexico. A single successful submarine campaign against the bauxite convoys could starve American smelters of raw material within months. The preemptive deployment of American troops to Dutch Guyana before Pearl Harbor, before the official declaration of war, was a measure of how seriously the government took the aluminum supply chain. The Arkansas deposits were useful, but insufficient. Without Caribbean bauxite, the smelters would run dry. The bauxite was shipped to alumina refineries, large chemical plants that dissolved the ore in hot caustic soda, filtered out the impurities, and precipitated nearly pure aluminum oxide called alumina. Approximately 2 tons of bauxite yielded 1 ton of alumina. The major refineries were in Mobile, Alabama, East St. Louis, Illinois, and along the Gulf Coast. The alumina was then shipped by rail to the smelters, where the Hall-Heroult process converted it into metallic aluminum. 2 tons of alumina yielded approximately 1 ton of aluminum. The smelters were located wherever cheap electricity was available, along the Columbia River, in the Tennessee Valley, and near other hydroelectric installations. The aluminum ingots were then shipped to fabrication plants, where they were rolled into sheet, extruded into structural shapes, forged into engine components, or cast into the thousands of parts required for a modern aircraft. Boeing in Seattle, Douglas in Long Beach, Consolidated in San Diego, North American in Dallas. Every aircraft manufacturer was a customer for aluminum from the smelters of the Pacific Northwest and the Tennessee Valley. The entire chain, from tropical clay to finished aircraft, involved ships, railways, chemical plants, smelters, rolling mills, and assembly lines spread across thousands of miles. A disruption at any point could ripple through the system. The saboteurs who landed on those beaches in 1942 understood this. The smelters were the choke point. The scale of the American aluminum expansion is best understood through numbers. In 1939, the United States produced 164,000 tons of aluminum. Germany, by comparison, produced 199,000 tons. It was the world's leading producer. This gap alarmed American military planners, who understood that the nation with the most aluminum would build the most aircraft, and the nation with the most aircraft would control the sky. By 1941, American production had risen to 309,000 tons. By 1942, it had reached approximately 521,000 tons. By 1943, it was 920,000 tons. By 1944, it peaked at 1.25 million tons, a nearly eight-fold increase from pre-war levels in 5 years. American aluminum production in 1944 exceeded the combined output of Germany, Japan, Italy, and every other Axis nation. American production alone supplied not only American aircraft factories, but also British factories and Soviet factories through Lend-Lease. The Soviet Union received nearly 330,000 metric tons of aluminum from America between 1941 and 1945, aluminum that went into Yakovlev and Lavochkin fighters on the Eastern Front. Without American aluminum, the Soviet Air Force could not have produced the aircraft that supported the Red Army's westward advance from Stalingrad to Berlin. The aluminum that flowed through Lend-Lease was not a gift, it was a strategic investment. Every Soviet fighter built with American aluminum was a fighter that did not have to be built in an American factory or flown by an American pilot. Every German aircraft shot down over the Eastern Front by a Soviet plane made of American aluminum was one fewer German aircraft available to oppose the bombers of the 8th Air Force over Europe. Canada, too, was a critical part of the aluminum equation. Alcan, the aluminum company of Canada, originally a subsidiary of Alcoa, operated the world's largest aluminum production site at Arvida in Quebec's Saguenay region, powered by the massive hydroelectric installations on the Saguenay River. Canada built the Bagotville Air Base specifically to protect the Arvida complex, a measure of how important Canadian aluminum production was to the Allied war effort. The combined North American aluminum output, American and Canadian, dwarfed anything the Axis could produce. 300,000 aircraft were produced by the United States during the war. In 1944 alone, the country built more aircraft than Japan built in the entire war. Each aircraft required thousands of pounds of aluminum alloy, structural members, skin panels, engine components, control surfaces. The B-17 alone consumed approximately 5 tons of aluminum per aircraft, and 12,731 B-17s were built. The B-24 Liberator, the most produced American bomber, consumed a similar amount, and 18,882 were built. The arithmetic is simple. 3 billion pounds of aluminum, 300,000 aircraft, 800 million rivets driven into aluminum skins. The air war was not won by courage alone, though courage was required in quantity that defies imagination. It was won by aluminum and by the electricity that produced it, and by the smelters that converted it, and by the industrial system that built and expanded those smelters at a pace that the enemy could not match. While the smelters expanded, the government also asked the American public to contribute. In July 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor, a nationwide aluminum scrap drive was launched. Citizens were asked to donate their aluminum pots, pans, coffee percolators, foil, and any other household aluminum items. The response was enormous and enthusiastic. Boy Scouts went door to door, collection points were established in every town, mountains of cookware piled up in schoolyards and public squares. The actual military value of the scrap drive was debatable. Household aluminum alloys were often unsuitable for aircraft-grade applications without extensive reprocessing. Some critics argued that the drive was more effective as propaganda, as a way to make every citizen feel personally involved in the war effort, than as a source of strategic material. The tonnage collected was modest compared to what the smelters produced. But the scrap drives served a real purpose beyond metallurgy. They built a culture of sacrifice. They taught Americans that the war required not just soldiers, but material, that every pot and pan was, in some abstract but real sense, part of an airplane. When the government later asked citizens to accept rationing of gasoline, rubber, meat, and sugar, the aluminum drive had already established the principle: the war takes everything, even your kitchen. Britain had launched a similar and more desperate campaign earlier. In 1940, during the Battle of Britain, the Minister of Aircraft Production, Lord Beaverbrook, directly appealed to the British public to surrender their aluminum cookware. The campaign was tinged with genuine urgency. Britain's aluminum supply was critically short, and every additional Spitfire required metal that the country did not have. British housewives donated their saucepans with a patriotic fervor that became one of the iconic images of the home front. Alcoa's contribution to the war effort was enormous, complicated, and controversial. The company managed 22 government-owned plants in addition to its own expanded facilities. Its engineers designed and supervised the construction of smelters that went from groundbreaking to operation in months, a pace that would be considered impossible in peacetime. Its metallurgists developed and refined the aluminum alloys used in every American military aircraft. Its workers, including thousands of women who entered the aluminum industry for the first time, operated smelters around the clock in conditions of extreme heat and toxic fumes. Alcoa took in $49 million in sales in 1939. By the peak of wartime production, the company's output had multiplied many times over. But the company also faced the antitrust lawsuit that had been filed in 1937 and that continued to work its way through the courts throughout the war. In 1945, the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against Alcoa, finding that it had monopolized the aluminum industry. The ruling, combined with the government's decision to sell wartime plants to competitors, permanently ended Alcoa's dominance. The irony was pointed. Alcoa had built, or managed the building of, most of the aluminum production capacity that won the air war. It had invested $300 million of its own capital. It had managed $450 million in government plants. It had trained the workers, developed the alloys, designed the smelters, and delivered the metal. And its reward, after the war, was the destruction of the monopoly that had made all of this possible. Arthur Vining Davis, the chairman of Alcoa, who had led the company since the early 1900s, protested bitterly. He argued that Alcoa had been punished for its own success, for being the only company capable of the expansion that the war demanded. His argument had merit, but the government's counter-argument also had merit. A single company controlling 100% of a strategic industry was a vulnerability, not a strength. The wartime experience had proven that aluminum was too important to be left in the hands of one producer. Here is the physics that won the air war. 1 ton of aluminum requires approximately 15,000 kilowatt-hours of electricity. The United States produced 1.25 million tons of aluminum in 1944. That is approximately 18.75 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity consumed by aluminum smelters alone in a single year, roughly 6% of total American electrical generation. Grand Coulee Dam, at its wartime capacity, could generate approximately 2,000 megawatts of power. Running continuously for a year, that produces roughly 17.5 billion kilowatt-hours, almost enough by itself to supply the entire American aluminum industry. The New Deal had built Grand Coulee to provide jobs and irrigation to the arid Columbia Basin. Its wartime role was unplanned and unpredicted. Axis planners, calculating American industrial potential in the late 1930s, appear to have underestimated the significance of these hydroelectric projects. A dam takes years to build. A smelter can be constructed in months. The dams were already there. The smelters went up around them, and the aluminum flowed. An aluminum electrolytic cell, a pot, is a steel shell roughly 20 feet long lined with carbon blocks that serve as the cathode. Molten cryolite fills the pot at a temperature of approximately 960 degrees Celsius. Alumina, purified aluminum oxide, is fed into the pot continuously, where it dissolves in the cryolite. Carbon anodes are lowered into the molten bath, and a current of 100,000 to 300,000 amperes passes through. The aluminum oxide is reduced. The oxygen combines with the carbon anodes, which are consumed in the process, and pure molten aluminum sinks to the bottom of the pot, where it is periodically siphoned off. A modern smelter contains hundreds of these pots, arranged in long rows called pot lines, in buildings that can be half a mile long. The heat is intense, the fluoride fumes are toxic, the noise is constant, the current never stops. Workers who tended the pots during the war, potmen, worked in temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius, breathing air contaminated with hydrogen fluoride, aluminum fluoride, and carbon dust. It was, by any measure, one of the most physically demanding and hazardous industrial jobs in America. They did it because the aircraft factories were waiting for the metal. Every day's delay was a day without bombers. When the fighting stopped, aluminum demand collapsed. Hundreds of workers were laid off. Smelters that had run around the clock were idled. The government-owned plants were declared surplus. But the surplus did not last. The post-war economic boom, driven by consumer demand for automobiles, appliances, and housing, required aluminum in quantities that rivaled wartime levels. Aircraft manufacturing continued, now for commercial aviation as well as the Cold War military buildup. And the government's deliberate policy of selling wartime plants to Reynolds and Kaiser created a competitive aluminum industry that drove innovation and reduced prices. By 1946, the Pacific Northwest alone produced 36% of the nation's aluminum. By the 1950s, it was 40%, with 10 smelters operating along the Columbia River system. The electricity from Bonneville and Grand Coulee, built for the Depression, proven in the war, now powered a peacetime aluminum industry that transformed American manufacturing. The Northwest smelters eventually closed, victims of rising electricity prices, global competition, and changing economics. By 2016, the last 2 operating aluminum smelters in the Pacific Northwest were idled. The era that had begun with the wartime emergency was over. But the aircraft it produced, the 300,000 machines that darkened the skies over Europe and the Pacific, had already changed the world. The aluminum they contained came from bauxite dug out of tropical clay, refined in Gulf Coast plants, smelted with electricity from New Deal dams, and fabricated in factories across the country. Every step of that chain was expanded, accelerated, and driven to its limits by a nation that understood in 1941 that the sky would belong to whoever could produce the most aluminum. Germany started the war as the world's leading aluminum producer. Germany lost the war in the sky. The connection is not coincidental, it is causal. Japan's aluminum story was even more tragic for Japan. The country had invested heavily in domestic smelting capacity through the 1930s, using its abundant hydroelectric power. Japanese production reached 71,740 tons in 1941 and peaked at 151,000 tons in 1944. But Japan had no significant domestic bauxite deposits. Before the war, it imported bauxite from the Dutch East Indies, the same deposits that Allied forces relied on. Japan's conquest of Malaya and the Netherlands East Indies in early 1942 gave it access to enormous bauxite reserves. But access to bauxite meant nothing without the ability to ship it home. As the American submarine campaign strangled Japanese shipping routes, bauxite imports dwindled and then collapsed. By 1944, the ore that Japan had conquered was rotting on tropical docks, while Japanese smelters sat idle for lack of raw material. Desperate attempts to use aluminiferous shale from Manchuria as a substitute proved impractical. The grade was too low and the processing costs too high. The result was that Japan could not replace its aircraft losses. Every Zero shot down, every bomber destroyed on the ground represented aluminum that could not be replenished. By 1945, Japanese aircraft production had collapsed, not because the factories were destroyed, though many were, but because the metal they needed to build aircraft could not reach them. Japan had the factories, it had the engineers, it had the pilots, though increasingly poorly trained ones. What it lacked was aluminum, and without aluminum there were no aircraft, and without aircraft there was no defense against the B-29s that burned its cities. America built more aircraft in 1944 alone than Japan built in the entire war. The Columbia River does not care about wars. It flows from its source in British Columbia through Washington and Oregon to the Pacific Ocean as it has for millions of years. The salmon still run, fewer than before the dams, but they run. Grand Coulee Dam stands where it was built. It still generates electricity. The irrigation canals it feeds still water the Columbia Basin. The towns that grew up around the wartime smelters, towns that boomed and then contracted as the aluminum industry rose and fell, still stand. But in the metal of every surviving wartime aircraft, in the B-17s preserved in museums, in the P-51 Mustangs that still fly at air shows, in the fragments of B-29s scattered across Pacific Islands, there is aluminum that was once electricity. Electricity that was once a river falling over a concrete wall in eastern Washington. Energy that was transformed through the Hall-Heroult process into the lightest structural metal known, and then transformed again through rivets and assembly lines and the courage of young men who flew the machines into air superiority over 2 continents. America had no aluminum in 1941. Not enough. Not nearly enough. By 1944, it had more than all its enemies combined. The smelters did not build themselves. The dams did not build themselves. The expansion from 164,000 tons to 1.25 million tons in 4 years, from a standing start with a monopoly that did not want to expand and a government that did not trust the monopoly, was one of the great industrial achievements of the 20th century. 8 German saboteurs understood what was at stake. They landed on American beaches with orders to destroy the smelters. They failed, and the aluminum kept flowing. From the river, through the dam, through the smelter, through the fabrication plant, onto the assembly line, into the sky. 300,000 aircraft. 3 billion pounds of aluminum. 1 river. That is the arithmetic of air power. And it began with dirt. Tropical clay dug from the ground in Arkansas and Guyana, processed by chemistry and electricity and industrial will into the metal that won the war in the sky. Here is what you should remember the next time you hold a piece of aluminum foil, or look at the wing of a commercial aircraft, or see a roll of aluminum sheet in a hardware store. That metal was once electricity. And the process that made it, the Hall-Heroult process, invented by two young men in 1886, scaled up by Alcoa, powered by New Deal dams, expanded by wartime emergency, is the same process used today. The chemistry has not changed. The physics has not changed. The requirement for enormous amounts of electrical power has not changed. What changed was the will. In 1941, the United States produced less aluminum than Germany. By 1944, it produced more than all the Axis powers combined. The difference was not technology. Both sides understood the Hall-Heroult process. The difference was not raw materials. Bauxite was available to both sides. The difference was electricity, and the infrastructure to generate it, and the political will to mobilize that infrastructure for a single purpose, building the aircraft that would darken the sky over 2 continents. 8 saboteurs landed on American beaches to destroy the smelters. They failed, and the aluminum kept flowing from the river, through the dam, through the smelter, through the fabrication plant, onto the assembly line, and into the sky. The river still flows, the dam still stands, the metal still flies.